Chapter 18. The Wrong Road. The next day, our departure took place at a very early hour. There was no time for the least delay. According to my account, we had 5 days' hard work to get back to the place where the galleries divided. I can never tell all the sufferings we endured upon our return. My uncle bore them like a man who has been in the wrong, that is, with concentrated and suppressed anger. Hans, with all the resignation of his specific character, and I confess that I did nothing but complain and despair. I had no heart for this bad fortune. But there was one consolation. Defeat at the outset would probably upset the whole journey. As I had expected from the first, our supply of water gave completely out on our first day's march. Our provisions of liquid was reduced to our supply of shitem. But this horrible, nay, I will say it, this infernal liquor burnt the throat, and I could not even bear the sight of it. I found the temperature to be stifling. I was paralyzed with fatigue. More than once I was about to fall insensible to the ground. The whole party then halted, and the worthy Icelander and my excellent uncle did their best to console and comfort me. I could, however, plainly see that my uncle was contending painfully against the extreme fatigues of our journey, and the awful torture generated by the absence of water. At length the time came when I ceased to recollect anything, when all was one awful, hideous, fantastic dream. At last, on Tuesday, the 7th of the month of July, after crawling on our hands and knees for many hours, more dead than alive, we reached the point of junction between the galleries. I lay like a log, an inert mass of human flesh on the arid lava soil. It was then 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, leaning against the wall, tried to nibble away at some pieces of biscuit, while deep groans and sighs escaped from my scorched and swollen lips. Then I fell off into a kind of deep lethargy. Presently I felt my uncle approach, and lift me up tenderly in his arms. "Oh, you poor boy," I heard him say in a tone of deep commiseration. I was profoundly touched by these words, being by no means accustomed to signs of womanly weakness in the professor. I caught his trembling hands in mine and gave them a gentle pressure. He allowed me to do so without resistance, looking at me kindly all the time. His eyes were wet with tears. I then saw him take the gourd which he wore at his side. To my surprise, or rather my stupefaction, he placed it to my lips. "Drink, my boy," he said. Was it possible my ears had not deceived me? Was my uncle mad? I looked at him with, I am sure, quite an idiotic expression. I could not believe him. I too much feared the counteraction of disappointment. "Drink," he said, again. Had I heard aright? Before, however, I could ask myself the question a second time, a mouthful of water cooled my parched lips and throat. One mouthful, but I do believe it brought me back to life. I thanked my uncle by clasping my hands. My heart was too full to speak. "Yes," said he, "one mouthful of water. The very last, do you hear, my boy? The very last. I have taken care of it at the bottom of my bottle as the apple of my eye. 20 times, 100 times, I have resisted the fearful desire to drink it. But no, Harry, I saved it for you." "My dear uncle," I exclaimed, and the big tears rolled down my hot and feverish cheeks. "Yes, my poor boy. I knew that when you reached this place, a crossroads in the earth, you would fall down half dead, and I saved my last drop of water in order to restore you." "Thanks," I cried. "Thanks from my heart." As little as my thirst was really quenched, I had nevertheless partially recovered my strength. The contracted muscles of my throat relaxed, and the inflammation of my lips in some measure subsided. At all events, I was able to speak. "Well," I said, "there can be no doubt as to what we have to do. Water has utterly failed us. Our journey is therefore at an end. Let us return." While I spoke thus, my uncle evidently avoided my face. He held down his head. His eyes were turned in every possible direction but the right one. "Yes," I continued, getting excited by my own words, "we must go back to Sneffels. May heaven give us strength to enable us once more to revisit the light of day. Would that we now stood in the summit of the crater." "Go back," said my uncle, speaking to himself. "And must it be so?" "Go back, yes, and without losing a single moment," I vehemently cried. For some moments there was silence under that dark and gloomy vault. "So, my dear Harry," said the professor in a very singular tone of voice, "those few drops of water have not sufficed to restore your energy and courage." "Courage!" I cried. "I see that you're quite as downcast as before. Instead give way to discouragement and despair." What then was the man made of, and what other projects were entering his fertile and audacious brain? You are not discouraged, sir? What? Give up just as we are on the verge of success? He cried. Never. Never shall it be said that Professor Hartwig retreated. Then we must make up our minds to perish, I cried with a helpless sigh. No, Harry, my boy, certainly not. Go, leave me. I am very far from desiring your death. Take Hans with you. I will go on alone. You ask us to leave you? Leave me, I say. I want to take in this dangerous and perilous adventure. I will carry it to the end, or I will never return to the surface of Mother Earth. Go, Harry. Once more I say to you, go! My uncle as he spoke was terribly excited. His voice, which before had been tender, almost womanly, became harsh and menacing. He appeared to be struggling with desperate energy against the impossible. I did not wish to abandon him at the bottom of that abyss, while, on the other hand, the instinct of preservation told me to fly. Meanwhile, our guide was looking on with profound calmness and indifference. He appeared to be an unconcerned party, and yet he perfectly well knew what was going on between us. Our gestures sufficiently indicated the different roads each wished to follow, and which each tried to influence the other to undertake. But Hans appeared not to take the slightest interest in what was really a question of life and death for us all, but waited quite ready to obey the signal which should say go aloft, or to resume his desperate journey into the interior of the earth. How then I wished with all my heart and soul that I could make him understand my words, my representations, my sighs and groans. The earnest accents into which I should have spoken should have convinced that cold, hard nature. Those fearful dangers and perils of which the stolid guide had no idea. I would have pointed them out to him. I would have, as it were, made him see and feel. Between us, we might have convinced the obstinate professor. If the worst had come to the worst, we could have compelled him to return to the summit of Sneffels. I quietly approached Hans. I caught his hand in mine. He never moved the muscle. I indicated to him the road to the top of the crater. He remained motionless. My panting form, my haggard countenance, must have indicated the extent of my sufferings. The Icelander gently shook his head and pointed to my uncle. Master, he said. The word is Icelandic, as well as English. The master! I cried, beside myself with fury. Madman! No, I tell you, he is not the master of our lives. We must fly! We must drag him with us. Do you hear me? Do you understand me, I say? I have already explained that I held Hans by the arm. I tried to make him rise from his seat. I struggled with him and tried to force him away. My uncle now interposed. My good Henry, be calm, he said. I will obtain nothing from my devoted follower. Therefore, listen to what I have to say. I folded my arms as well as I could, and looked my uncle full in the face. This wretched want of water, he said, is the sole obstacle to the success of my project. In the entire gallery made of lava, schist, and coal, it is true we found not one liquid molecule. It is quite possible that we may be more fortunate in the western tunnel. My sole reply was to shake my head with an air of deep incredulity. Listen to me in the end, said the professor in his well-known lecturing voice. While you lay yonder without life or motion, I undertook a reconnoitering journey into the conformation of this other gallery. I discovered that it goes directly downwards into the bowels of the earth, and in a few hours will take us to the old granitic formation. In this we shall undoubtedly find innumerable springs. The nature of the rock makes this a mathematical certainty, and instinct agrees with logic to say that it is so. Now, this is a serious proposition, which I have to make to you. When Christopher Columbus asked of his men 3 days to discover the land of promise, his men, ill, terrified, and hopeless, gave him 3 days. And the New World was discovered. Now I, the Christopher Columbus of the subterranean region, only ask of you 1 more day. If, when that time is expired, I have not found the water of which we are in search, I swear to you, I will give up my mighty enterprise and return to the earth's surface. Despite my irritation and despair, I knew how much it cost my uncle to make this proposition, and to hold such conciliatory language. Under the circumstances, what could I do but yield? Well, I cried, let it be as you wish. May heaven reward your superhuman energy. But as unless we discover water, our hours are numbered, let us lose no time, but go ahead. Chapter 19. The Western Gallery, A New Route. Our descent was now resumed by means of the second gallery. Hans took up his post in front as usual. We had not gone more than 100 yards when the professor carefully examined the walls. "This is a primitive formation. We are on the right road. Onward is our hope." While the whole earth got cool in the first hours of the world's morning, the diminution of the volume of the earth produced a state of dislocation in its upper crust, followed by ruptures, crevices, and fissures. The passage was a fissure of this kind, through which, ages ago, had flowed the eruptive granite. The thousand windings and turnings formed an inextricable labyrinth through the ancient soil. As we descended, successions of layers composing the primitive soil appeared with the utmost fidelity of detail. Geological science considers this primitive soil as a base of the mineral crust, and it has been recognized that it is composed of 3 different strata or layers, all resting on the immovable rock known as granite. No mineralogist had even found themselves placed in such a marvelous position to study nature in all her real and naked beauty. The sounding rod, a mere machine, could not bring to the surface of the earth the objects of value for which the study of its internal structure, which we were about to see with our own eyes, to touch with our own hands. Remember that I am writing this after the journey. Across the streaks of the rocks, colored with beautiful green tints, wound metallic threads of copper, manganese, with traces of platinum and gold. I could not help gazing at these riches buried in the entrails of Mother Earth, and of which no man would have the enjoyment to the end of time. These treasures, mighty and inexhaustible, were buried in the morning of the earth's history, at such awful depths, that no crowbar or pickaxe will ever drag them from their tomb. The light of our Ruhmkorff's coil, increased tenfold by the myriad of prismatic masses of rock, sent its jet of fire in every direction, and I could fancy myself traveling through a huge hollow diamond, the rays of which produced myriads of extraordinary effects. Towards 6 o'clock, this festival of light began sensibly and visibly to decrease, and soon almost ceased. The sides of the gallery assumed a crystallized tint with a somber hue. White mica began to commingle more freely with feldspar and quartz, to form what may be called the true rock, the stone which is hard above all, and that supports, without being crushed, the 4 stories of the earth's soil. We were walled by an immense prison of granite. It is now 8 o'clock, and still there was no sign of water. The sufferings I endured were horrible. My uncle now kept at the head of our little column. Nothing could induce him to stop. I, meanwhile, had but one real thought. My ear was keenly on the watch to catch the sound of a spring, but no pleasant sound of falling water fell upon my listening ear. But at last the time came when my limbs refused to carry me longer. I contended heroically against the terrible tortures I endured, because I did not wish to compel my uncle to halt. To him I knew this would be the last fatal stroke. Suddenly I felt a deadly faintness come over me. My eyes could no longer see. My knees shook. I gave one despairing cry and fell. "Help! Help! I'm dying!" My uncle turned and slowly retraced his steps. He looked at me with folded arms, and then allowed one sentence to escape in hollow accents from his lips. "All is over." The last thing I saw was a face fearfully distorted with pain and sorrow, and then my eyes closed. When I again opened them, I saw my companions lying near me, motionless, wrapped in their huge traveling rugs. Were they asleep or dead? For myself, sleep was wholly out of the question. My fainting fit over, I was wakeful as a lark. I suffered too much for sleep to visit my eyelids, the more that I thought myself sick unto death, dying. The last words spoken by my uncle seemed to be buzzing in my ears. "All is over." And it was probable that he was right. In the state of prostration to which I was reduced, it was madness to think of ever again seeing the light of day. Above were miles upon miles of the earth's crust. As I thought of it, I could fancy the whole weight resting on my shoulders. I was crushed, annihilated, and exhausted myself in vain attempts to turn in my granite bed. Hours upon hours passed away. A profound and terrible silence reigned around us. The silence of the tomb. Nothing could make itself heard through these gigantic walls of granite. The very thought was stupendous. Presently, despite my apathy, despite the kind of deadly calm into which I was cast, something aroused me. It was a slight but peculiar noise. While I was watching intently, I observed that the tunnel was becoming dark. Then, gazing through the dim light that remained, I thought I saw the Icelander taking his departure, lamp in hand. Why had he acted thus? Did Hans the guide mean to abandon us? My uncle lay fast asleep, or dead. I tried to cry out and arouse him. My voice, feebly issuing from my parched and fevered lips, found no echo in that fearful place. My throat was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. The obscurity had by this time become intense, and at last even the faint sound of the guide's footsteps was lost in the blank distance. My soul seemed filled with anguish, and death appeared welcome. Only let it come quickly. "Hans is leaving us," I cried. "Hans! Hans! If you are a man, come back!" These words were spoken to myself. They could not be heard aloud. Nevertheless, after the first few moments of terror were over, I was ashamed of my suspicions against a man who hitherto had behaved so admirably. Nothing in his conduct or character justified suspicion. Moreover, a moment's reflection reassured me. His departure could not be a flight. Instead of ascending the gallery, he was going deeper down into the gulf. Had he had any bad design, his way would have been upwards. This reasoning calmed me a little, and I began to hope. The good and peaceful and imperturbable Hans would certainly not have arisen from his sleep without some serious or grave motive. Was he bent on a voyage of discovery? During the deep, still silence of the night, had he at last heard that sweet murmur about which we were all so anxious? Chapter 20. Water, where is it? A bitter disappointment. During a long, weary hour, there crossed my wildly delirious brain all sorts of reasons as to what could have aroused our quiet and faithful guide. The most absurd and ridiculous ideas passed through my head, each more impossible than the other. I believe I was either half or wholly mad. Suddenly, however, there arose, as it were from the depths of the earth, a voice of comfort. It was a sound of footsteps. Hans was returning. Presently the uncertain light began to shine upon the walls of the passage, and then it came in view far down the sloping tunnel. At last Hans himself appeared. He approached my uncle, placed his hand upon his shoulder, and gently awakened him. My uncle, as soon as he saw who it was, instantly arose. "Well?" exclaimed the professor. "Vatten," said the hunter. I did not know a single word of the Danish language, and yet by some sort of mysterious instinct I understood what the guide had said. "Water! Water!" I cried in a wild and frantic tone, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman. "Water!" murmured my uncle, in a voice of deep emotion and gratitude. "Va! The dot. Below." "Where? Below?" I understood every word. I had caught the hunter by the hands, and I shook them heartily, while he looked on with perfect calmness. The preparations for our departure did not take long, and we were soon making a rapid descent into the tunnel. An hour later we had advanced 1,000 yards, and descended 2,000 feet. At this moment I heard an accustomed and well-known sound running along the floors of the granite rock, a kind of dull and sullen roar, like that of a distant waterfall. During the first half-hour of our advance, not finding the discovered spring, my feelings of intense suffering appeared to return. Once more, I began to lose all hope. My uncle, however, observing how downhearted I was again becoming, took up the conversation. "Hans was right," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "That is a dull roaring of a torrent." "A torrent," I cried, delighted at even hearing the welcome words. "There is not the slightest doubt about it," he replied. "A subterranean river is flowing beside us." I made no reply, but hastened on, once more animated by hope. I began not even to feel the deep fatigue which hitherto had overpowered me. The very sound of this glorious murmuring water already refreshed me. We could hear it increasing in volume every moment. The torrent, which for a long time could be heard flowing over our heads, now ran distinctly along the left wall, roaring, rushing, spluttering, and still falling. Several times I passed my hand along the rock, hoping to find some traces of humidity, of the slightest percolation. Alas, in vain. Again a half-hour passed in the same weary toil, and again we advanced. It now became evident that the hunter, during his absence, had not been able to carry his researches any farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to the dwellers in mountain regions and water-finders, he smelt the living spring through the rock. Still he had not seen the precious liquid. He had neither quenched his own thirst, nor brought us one drop of his gourd. Moreover, we still made the disastrous discovery that, if our progress continued, we should be moving away from the torrent, the sound of which gradually diminished. We turned back. Hans halted at the precise spot where the sound of the torrent appeared nearest. I could bear the suspense and suffering no longer, and seated myself against the wall, behind which I could hear the water seething and effervescing not 2 feet away. But a solid wall of granite still separated us from it. Hans looked keenly at me, and strange enough for once I thought I saw a smile on his imperturbable face. He rose from a stone on which he had been seated and took up the lamp. I could not help rising and following. We moved slowly along the firm and solid granite wall. I watched him with mingled curiosity and eagerness. Presently he halted and placed his ear against the dry stone, moving slowly along, and listening with the most extreme care and attention. I understood at once that he was searching for the exact spot where the torrent's roar was most plainly heard. This point he soon found in a lateral wall on the left side, about 3 feet above the level of the tunnel floor. I was in a state of intense excitement. I scarcely dared believe what the eider duck hunter was about to do. It was, however, impossible in a moment more not to both understand and applaud, and even to smother him in my embraces, when I saw him raise a heavy crowbar and commence an attack upon the rock itself. "Saved!" I cried. "Yes!" cried my uncle, even more excited and delighted than myself. "Hans is quite right. Oh, is a very excellent man. We should never thought of such an idea." And nobody else, I think, would have done so. Such a process, simple as it seemed, would most certainly not have entered our heads. Nothing could be more dangerous than to begin the work with pickaxes in that particular part of the globe. Supposing while he was at work a break-up were to take place, and supposing the torrent, once having gained an inch, were to take an ell, and come pouring bodily through the broken rock. Not one of these dangers was chimerical. They were only too real. But at that moment no fear of falling in from the roof, or even of indignation, was capable of stopping us. Our thirst was so intense that to quench it we would have dug below the bed of old ocean itself. Hans went quietly to work, a work which neither my uncle nor I would have undertaken at any price. Our impatience was so great that if we had once begun with pickaxe and crowbar, the rock soon would have split into 100 fragments. The guide, on the contrary, calm, ready, and moderate, bore away at the hard rock by little steady blows of his instrument, making no attempt at a larger hole than about 6 inches. As I stood, I heard, or I thought I heard, the roar of the torrent momentarily increasing in loudness, and at times I almost felt the pleasant sensation of water upon my parched lips. At the end of what appeared an age, Hans had made a hole which enabled the crowbar to enter 2 feet into the solid rock. He had been at work exactly an hour. It appeared a dozen. I was getting wild with impatience. My uncle began to think of using more violent measures. I had the greatest difficulty in checking him. He had just got hold of his crowbar when a loud and welcome hiss was heard. Then a stream, or rather jet of water, burst through the wall, and came out with such force as to hit the opposite side. Hans, the guide, who was half upset by the shock, was scarcely able to keep down a cry of pain and grief. I understood his meaning when, plunging my hands into the sparkling jet, I myself gave a wild and frantic cry. The water was scalding hot. "Boiling!" I cried in bitter disappointment. "Well, never mind," said my uncle. "It will soon get cool." The tunnel began to be filled by clouds of vapor, while a small stream ran away into the interior of the earth. In a short time we had some sufficiently cool to drink. We swallowed it in huge mouthfuls. Oh, what exalted delight! What rich and incomparable luxury! What was this water? Whence did it come? To us, what was that? The simple fact was, it was water, and though still a tingle of warmth about it, it brought back to the heart that life which, but for it, must surely have faded away. I drank greedily, almost without tasting it. When, however, I had almost quenched my ravenous thirst, I made a discovery. "Why, this is chalybeate water." "A most excellent stomatic," replied my uncle, "and highly mineralized. Here's a journey verse 20 to Spa." "It's very good," I replied. "I should think so. Water found 6 miles underground. There's a peculiarly inky flavor about it, which is by no means disagreeable. Hans may congratulate himself on having made a rare discovery. What do you say, nephew, according to the usual custom of travelers, to name the stream after him?" "Good," said I. The name of Hansbach, Hans Brook, was at once agreed upon. Hans was not a bit more proud after hearing our determination than he was before. After having taken a very small modicum of the welcome refreshment, he had seated himself in a corner with his usual imperturbable gravity. "Now," said I, "it is not worth while letting this water run to waste." "What is the use?" replied my uncle. "The source from which this river rises is inexhaustible." "Never mind," I continued. "Let us fill our goat-skinning gourds, and then try to stop the opening up." My advice, after some hesitation, was followed or attempted to be followed. Hans picked up all the broken pieces of granite he had knocked out, and using some tow he happened to have about him, tried to shut up the fissure he had made in the wall. All he did was to scald his hands. The pressure was too great, and all our attempts were utter failures. "It is evident," I remarked, "that the upper surface of these springs is situated at a very great height above, as we may fairly infer from the great pressure of the jet." "That is by no means doubtful," replied my uncle. "If this column of water is about 32,000 feet high, the atmospheric pressure must be something enormous. But a new idea has just struck me." "And what is that?" "Why be at so much trouble to close this aperture?" "Because—" I hesitated and stammered, having no real reason. "When our water bottles are empty, we are not at all sure that we shall be able to fill them," observed my uncle. "I think that is very probable." "Well then, let us water run. It will, of course, naturally follow in our track and will serve to guide and refresh us." "I think the idea is a good one," I cried in reply. "And with this rivulet as a companion, there is no further reason why we should not succeed in our marvelous project." "Ah, my boy," said the professor, laughing. "After all, you are coming around." "More than that, I am now confident of ultimate success. One moment, nephew mine. Let us begin by taking some hours of repose." I had suddenly forgotten that it was night. The chronometer, however, informed me of the fact. Soon we were sufficiently restored and refreshed, and had all fallen into a profound sleep. Chapter 21. Under the Ocean. By the next day we had nearly forgotten our past sufferings. The first sensation I experienced was not surprise at being thirsty, and I actually asked myself the reason. The running stream, which flowed in rippling wavelets at my feet, was a satisfactory reply. We breakfasted with good appetite, and then drank our fill of the excellent water. I felt myself quite a new man, ready to go anywhere my uncle chose to lead. I began to think, why should not a man as seriously convinced as my uncle succeed, with so excellent a guide as worthy Hans, and so devoted a nephew as myself? These were the brilliant ideas which now invaded my brain. Had the proposition now been made to go back to the summit of Mount Sneffels, I should have declined the offer in the most indignant manner. But fortunately there was no question of going up. We were about to descend farther into the interior of the earth. "All right, let us be moving," I cried, awakening the echoes of the old world. We resumed our march on Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. The great granite tunnel, as it went round by sinuous and winding ways, presented every now and then sharp turns, and in fact all the appearance of a labyrinth. Its direction, however, was in general toward the southwest. My uncle made several pauses in order to consult his compass. The gallery now began to trend downwards in a horizontal direction, with about 2 inches of fall in every furlong. The murmuring stream flowed quietly at our feet. I could not but compare it to some familiar spirit, guiding us through the earth, and I dabbled my fingers into its tepid water, which sang like a naiad as we progressed. My good humor began to assume a mythological character. As for my uncle, he began to complain of the horizontal character of the road. His route, he found, began to be indefinitely prolonged, instead of sliding down the celestial ray, according to his expression. But we had no choice, and as long as our road led toward the center, however little progress we made, there was no reason to complain. Moreover, from time to time the slopes were much greater, the naiad sang more loudly, and we began to dip downwards in earnest. As yet, however, I felt no painful sensation. I had not got over the excitement of the discovery of water. That day and the next we did a considerable amount of horizontal and relatively very little vertical traveling. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our estimation, we ought to have been 30 leagues to the southeast of Reykjavik, and about 2 leagues and a half deep. We now received a rather startling surprise. Under our feet there opened a horrible well. My uncle was so delighted that he actually clapped his hands, as he saw how steep and sharp was the descent. "Ah, ah!" he cried in rapturous delight. "This will take us a long way. Look at the projections on the rock. Ah!" he exclaimed. "It is a fearful staircase." Hans, however, who in all our troubles had never given up the ropes, took care so to dispose of them as to prevent any accidents. Our descent then began. I dare not call it a perilous descent, for I was already too familiar with that sort of work to look upon it as anything but a very ordinary affair. This well was a kind of narrow opening in the massive granite of the kind known as a fissure. The contraction of the terrestrial scaffolding, when it suddenly cooked, had been evidently the cause. If it had been ever served in former times as the kind of funnel through which passed the eruptive masses vomited by Sneffels, I was at a loss to explain how it had left no mark. We were, in fact, descending a spiral, something like those winding staircases in use in modern houses. We were compelled every quarter of an hour or thereabouts to sit down in order to rest our legs. Our calves ached. We then seated ourselves on some projecting rock with our legs hanging over, and gossiped while we ate a mouthful, drinking still from the pleasantly warm running stream which had not deserted us. It is scarcely necessary to say that in this curiously shaped fissure, the Hansbach had become a cascade to the detriment of its size. It was still, however, sufficient, and more for our wants. Besides, we knew that, as soon as the declivity ceased to be so abrupt, the stream must resume its peaceful course. At this moment it reminded me of my uncle, his impatience and rage. While when it flowed more peacefully, I pictured to myself the placidity of the Icelandic guide. During the whole of 2 days, the 6th and 7th of July, we followed the extraordinary spiral staircase of the fissure, penetrating 2 leagues farther into the crust of the earth, which put us 5 leagues below the level of the sea. On the 8th, however, at 12 o'clock in the day, the fissure suddenly assumed a much more gentle slope, still trending in a southeast direction. The road now became comparatively easy, at the same time dreadfully monotonous. It would have been difficult for matters to have turned out otherwise. Our peculiar journey had no chance of being diversified by landscape and scenery. At all events, such was my idea. At length, on Wednesday the 15th, we were actually 7 leagues, 21 miles, below the surface of the earth, and 50 leagues distant from the mountains of Sneffels. Though, if the truth be told, we were very tired. Our health had resisted all suffering, and was in a most satisfactory state. Our traveler's box of medicaments had not even been opened. My uncle was careful to note every hour the indications of the compass, of the manometer, and of the thermometer, all which he afterwards published in his elaborate philosophical and scientific account of our remarkable voyage. He was therefore able to give an exact relation of the situation. When therefore he informed me that we were 50 leagues in a horizontal direction distant from our starting point, I could not suppress a loud exclamation. "What is the matter now?" cried my uncle. "Nothing very important, only an idea has entered my head," was my reply. "Well outfitted, my boy. It is my opinion that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "Well, we can very easily find out," I replied, pulling out a map and compasses. "You see," I said, after careful measurement, "that I am not mistaken. We are far beyond Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues to the southeast will take us into the open sea." "Under the open sea!" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands with a delighted air. "Yes," I cried, "no doubt old ocean flows over our heads." "Well, my dear boy, what can be more natural? Do you not know that it is in the neighborhood of Newcastle there are coal mines, which have been worked far out under the sea?" Now my worthy uncle, the professor, no doubt regarded this discovery as a very simple fact, but to me the idea was by no means a pleasant one. And yet when one came to think the matter over seriously, what mattered it whether the plains and mountains of Iceland were suspended over our devoted heads, or the mighty billows of the Atlantic Ocean? The whole question rested on the solidity of the granite roof above us. However, I soon got used to the ideal for the passage now level, now running down, and still always to the southeast, kept going deeper and deeper into the profound abysses of Mother Earth. 3 days later, on the 18th day of July, on a Saturday, we reached a kind of vast grotto. My uncle here paid Hans his usual rix dollars, and it was decided that the next day should be a day of rest. Chapter 22. Sunday Below Ground. I awoke on Sunday morning without any sense of hurry and bustle attendant, on an immediate departure. Though the day to be devoted to repose and reflection was spent under such strange circumstances, and in so wonderful a place, the idea was a pleasant one. Besides, we all began to get used to this kind of existence. I had almost ceased to think of the sun, or a moon, of the stars, the trees, houses, and towns. In fact, about any terrestrial necessities. In our peculiar position we were far above such reflections. The grotto was a vast and magnificent hall. Along its granitic soil, the stream flowed placidly and pleasantly. So great a distance was it now from its fiery source that its water was scarcely lukewarm, and could be drunk without delay or difficulty. After a frugal breakfast, the professor made up his mind to devote some hours to putting his notes and calculations in order. "In the first place," he said, "I have a good many to verify and prove, in order that we may know our exact position. I wish to be able on our return to the upper regions to make a map of our journey, a kind of vertical section of the globe, which will be, as it were, the profile of the expedition." "That would indeed be a curious work, uncle, but can you make your observations with anything like certainty and precision?" "I can. I have never on any occasion failed to note with great care the angles and slopes. I am certain as to having made no mistake. Take the compass and examine how she points." I looked at the instrument with care. "East 1/4 southeast." "Very good," resumed the professor, noting the observation and going through some rapid calculations. "I make out we had journeyed 250 miles from the point of our departure." "Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads?" "Certainly. And at this very moment it is possible that fierce tempests are raging above, and that men and ships are battling against the angry blast just over our heads." "It is quite within the range of possibility," rejoiced my uncle, smiling. "And that whales are playing in shoals, thrashing the bottom of the ocean, the roof of our adamantine prison." "Be quite at rest on that point. There is no danger of their breaking through. But to return to our calculations. We are on the southeast, 250 miles from the base of Sneffels, and according to my preceding notes, I think we have gone 16 leagues in a downward direction." "16 leagues? 15 miles!" I cried. "I am sure of it. But that is the extreme limit allowed by science for the thickness of the Earth's crust," I replied, referring to my geological studies. "I do not contravene that assertion," was his quiet answer. "And at this stage of our journey, according to all known laws in the increase of heat, there should be a temperature of 1500 degrees of Reaumur. There should be, you say, my boy. In which case the granite would not exist, but be in a state of fusion. But you perceive, my boy, that it is not so, and that facts, as usual, are very stubborn things, overruling all theories. I am forced to yield to the evidence of my senses, but I am nevertheless very much surprised. What heat does the thermometer really indicate?" continued the philosopher. 27 6/10. So that science is wrong by 1474 degrees, and 4/10. According to which it is demonstrated that the proportional increase in temperature is an exploded error. Humphrey Davy here shines forth in all his glory. He is right, and I have acted wisely to believe him. Have you any answer to make for this statement?" Had I chosen to have spoken, I might have said a great deal. I in no way admitted the theory of Humphrey Davy. I still held out for the theory of proportional increase of heat, though I did not feel it. I was far more willing to allow that this chimney of an extinct volcano was covered by lava of a kind refractory to heat, in fact a bad conductor, which did not allow the great increase of temperature to percolate through its sides. The hot water jet supported my view of the matter. But without entering on a long and useless discussion, or seeking for new arguments to controvert my uncle, I contented myself with taking up facts as they were. "Well, sir, I take for granted that all your calculations are correct, but allow me to draw from them a rigorous and definite conclusion." "Go on, my boy, have your say," cried my uncle, good-humoredly. "At the place where we now are, under the latitude of Iceland, the terrestrial depth is about 1,583 leagues, 1,583 1/4. Well, suppose we say 1,600 in round numbers. Now, out of a voyage of 1,600 leagues, we have completed 16. As you say, what then? At the expense of a diagonal journey of no less than 85 leagues. Exactly. We have been 20 days about it. Exactly 20 days. Now 16 is the 100th part of our contemplated expedition. If we go down in this way, we shall be 2,000 days. That is about 5 years and a half going down. The professor folded his arms, listened, but did not speak. Without counting that if a vertical descent of 16 leagues costs us a horizontal of 85, we shall have to go about 8,000 leagues to the southeast, and we must therefore come out somewhere in the circumference long before we can hope to reach the center. "Bother your calculations," cried my uncle in one of his old rages. "On what basis do they vest? How do you know that this passage does not take us direct to the end we require? Moreover, I have in my favor, fortunately, a precedent. What I have undertaken to do, another has done, and he having succeeded, why should I not be equally successful?" "I hope indeed you will, but still, I suppose I may be allowed to—" "You are allowed to hold your tongue," cried Professor Hardwigg, "when you talk so unreasonably as this." I saw at once that the old doctorial professor was still alive in my uncle, and fearful to rouse his angry passions. I dropped the unpleasant subject. "Now then," he explained, "consult the manometer. What does it indicate?" "A considerable amount of pressure." "Very good. You see? Then by descending slowly, and by gradually accustoming ourselves to the density of this lower atmosphere, we shall not suffer." "I suppose not, except there may be a certain amount of pain in the ears," was my rather grim reply. "That, my dear boy, is nothing, and you will easily get rid of that source of discomfort by bringing the exterior air in communication with the air contained in your lungs." "Perfectly," said I, for I have quite made up my mind in no wise to contradict my uncle. I should fancy almost that I should experience a certain amount of satisfaction in making a plunge into this dense atmosphere. Have you taken note of how wonderfully sound it propagated? "Of course I have. There can be no doubt that the journey into the interior of the earth would be an excellent cure for deafness." "But then, uncle," I ventured mildly to observe, "this density will continue to increase." "Yes, according to a law which, however, is scarcely defined. It is true that the intensity of weight will diminish just in proportion to the depths to which we go. You know very well that it is on the surface of the earth that its action is most powerfully felt, while on the contrary, in the very center of the earth, bodies cease to have any weight at all." "I know that is the case, but as we progress, will not the atmosphere finally assume the density of water?" "I know it. When placed under the pressure of 710 atmospheres," cried my uncle with imperturbable gravity. "And when we are still lower down?" I asked with natural anxiety. "Well, lower down, the density will become even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog?" "Well, my worthy nephew, we must balance ourselves by filling our pockets with stones," said Professor Hardwigg. "Faith, uncle, you have an answer for everything," was my only reply. I began to feel that it was unwise of me to go any farther into the wild field of hypotheses, for I should certainly have revived some difficulty, or rather impossibility, that would have enraged the professor. It was evident, nevertheless, that the air under a pressure which might be multiplied by thousands of atmospheres would end by becoming perfectly solid, and that then admitting our bodies resisted the pressure, we should have to stop, in spite of all the reasonings in the world. Facts overcome all arguments. But I thought it best not to urge this argument. My uncle would simply have quoted the example of Sankosim. Supposing the learned Icelander's journey ever really to have taken place, there was one simple answer to be made. In the 16th century, neither the barometer nor the manometer had been invented. How then could Sankosim have been able to discover when he did reach the center of the earth? This unanswerable and learned objection I, however, kept to myself, and bracing up my courage, awaited the course of events, little aware of how adventurous yet were to be the incidents of our remarkable journey. The rest of this day of leisure and repose was spent in calculation and conversation. I made it a point to agree with the professor in everything, but I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without taking any such trouble about the cause and effect, went blindly onwards wherever destiny chose to lead him. Chapter 23. Alone. It must in all truth be confessed, things as yet had gone on well, and I should have acted in bad taste to have complained. If the true medium of our difficulties did not increase, it was within the range of possibility that we might ultimately reach the end of our journey. Then what a glory would be ours! I began in the newly aroused ardor of my soul to speak enthusiastically to the professor. Well, was I serious? The whole state in which we existed was a mystery, and it was impossible to know whether or not I was in earnest. For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid. Some were even of a more frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were going forever down into the solid interior mass. During some days, we actually descended 1.5 leagues, even 2 leagues towards the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them, we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide Hans. Without him, we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and thanks to him, many a dangerous pass was got over, where but for him, we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad, simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant? During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this particular period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory even now makes my soul shudder and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say, they were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles of rocks and oceans and continents and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. On that memorable day, the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was on this occasion walking on in front. My uncle had charge of one of the Ruhmkorff coils, and I had possession of the other. By means of its light, I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning around, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle had stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is to go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps, and while doing so, walked for at least a quarter of an hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul. I called aloud. No reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began for the first time to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be 2 roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do was go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I'd ever even seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, well knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no. The most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that if I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, come, said I to myself. Since there's only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, I must make haste. I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener, had there been one, that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas, and to reunite them under the form of reasoning, required some time. I could not all at once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage on his shoulder. I now remembered this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as was possible. There is another sure means of not losing my way, a thread to guide me through the labyrinthine subterraneous retreat, one which I had forgotten, my faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle, when he refused to allow the eater-hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind, before I started upwards, that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite, the stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared.